Hi there, friends. Welcome to another episode of the Self-Care for Performers podcast. I'm your host, Marissa Moses, and thanks so much for joining me. Welcome to episode 2. I am so excited to come back today to share a part 2 of some of my conversations with Roksana. Today's episode I wasn't anticipating sharing with you because the meat of this conversation with Roksana did not get recorded. But after sharing the first episode last week, I wanted to provide another window into the kind of playful connection Roksana and I share that I feel is very present in this conversation you're about to hear. What I love about this upcoming conversation I'm about to release into the space between you and I is that Roksana and I were in my living room having some tea, connecting in conversation, and it felt very fluid, easeful, and really joyful in our experience of how we were connecting to what we wanted to share with you. And so some of the conversation points might be a little redundant, but I think overall the conversation is very different than the first episode. So I think this is also a wonderful way for us to provide windows into the different kinds of connections we can have with the same person and the different ways we can show up again and again with even the same intention and how it can turn out differently. Because I think that as performing artists, sometimes we hold ourselves to these perfectionistic standards that just aren't reasonable, even responsible for the hearts and the well-being of ourselves and the collaborators that we're working with. So with that said, I do hope you enjoy this window into conversation with me and Roksana. I think it's a really lovely one, and I do hope that you enjoy. I am here with a dear friend and a beautiful performing artist, Roksana. And would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yes. Hi, Marissa, and hi, everyone else. My name is Roksana Zeinapur. I'm a performer, practitioner, and a facilitator, and a seeker and learner of all kinds of things, and a friend and admirer of Marissa's work. And very excited to be here and talk about all the things that we've been talking about for years, really.
Yeah, we've known each other now for how many years?
6-7 years?
6 or 7 years, I think. And we met in Venice Beach at a little theater called the Electric Lodge in a wonderful workshop that, I stumbled into. She had been there for a while, and it was an embodiment workshop, all about embodied empathy and working from a somatic, soma meaning body, based kind of intuitive space. And I love our first meeting because would you describe a little bit about how that first meeting went with your...
Well, let's see.
Maybe a framing of what we do.
Let's see what I remember, and then you can fill in the gaps. The gist of it is that we, upon first meeting each other, ended up in this somatic, psychological, spiritual experiences where we were the same person. We were sort of mirror versions of one person, which I think it was me, and you stepped in, right?
Yes.
To be another version of me.
So first, to frame a little bit more.
So the work
so the work that we were doing was with a man named Joseph Culp, who has co-founded, would you say? Developed a modality called walking in your shoes with a partner of his. Do you recall his name?
I know it was his therapist, but I cannot remember his name.
Let's pause for a second and look it up. So Walking in Your Shoes was developed by Joseph Culp in conjunction with his psychotherapist, John Cogswell.
That's right.
And they have developed this form of embodied empathy, which is an improvisationally based somatic practice, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's hard to always articulate exactly what it is.
Right.
But it's an improvisational. I feel like it almost looks like an acting improvisation exercise, even though it's not a performance in any way, but it does appear that way if someone's watching. Like, it seems like they're actors improvising, which acting was very much a part of the workshop. It was a theater kind of training / personal development.
And
workshop, right?
Yes, and Joseph himself is an actor and a filmmaker. And so his background is theater and film, and his co-creator of the method, his background was psychotherapy. So they came at it from a very interesting and I think really nice space where there was a history of embodied play from the theater background, and also with this cognitive awareness, understanding of the approach that one can take from holding space around an embodied experience as opposed to directing and crafting a story as a director.
Mm-hmm.
Do you say? So it's sort of like we see the story naturally emerge from the innate aspects of the walk itself, as opposed to having a script or having lines or having choreography for a dancer or a song that has lyrics as a singer, right? That the score or the script or the way in which things unfold happens through really how we're listening to our body. And basically how we get into it is, would you share a bit about that?
Yes. So it's pretty simple. And I guess I keep sort of qualifying it. It seems like it can't be that simple. There's got to be something else going on, but it really is as simple as making a statement of intention. Say, I am now, whatever it is that you want to embody. And it could be a character, it could be a narrative, it can be something personal, like a feeling, even a health thing. I walked many a health issue, a relationship with another person or another person. So let's say you want to walk your anxiety, which I've done that walk. You say, I am now my anxiety, and then you move and you allow the impulses of the body to inform the experience that you're about to have. And the goal is not to go into storytelling or not to sort of craft some kind of narrative or an experience, really allow it to happen to you. And then through that experience, information comes up and experience comes up. And I find that it's always for one's benefit and also for the benefit of the people witnessing it. And there's always a healing experience cycle that's completed or
there are targeted questions that have been developed for part of the process that really also helps you kind of attune to sort of the overall essence of what things feel like from this intention you're embodying, and then getting closer to, are you aware of any parts of the body? What does that part of the body feel like? If it had a voice, what would it say? What does it need? How does it relate to the outside world? How do you see the world? How does the world see you? Things like that, where you're sort of orienting to identification or personification of this embodiment of the intention.
And that's the facilitator, right?
Yes.
It's important to mention that it's best done with a facilitator and a group of people where someone can guide you and ask you questions so you don't get too wrapped up in your story or your experiences or your confusion sometimes.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because I think this is a lovely parallel for the performing artists that we can talk about here, which is, as performing artists, sometimes when we are engaged in a role, there can be a degree of like channeling an experience or tuning into almost an aspect of ourselves that loses touch with reality, and you become sort of encased in the experience of the character or of the essence that you're embodying. And I think that this practice is a practice of doing that in many ways, having the willingness and the bravery to sort of just be with what's present, which we talk about in acting classes all the time, to be in the moment, connecting to presence. And this practice really does drop you into the body, drop you into the now, even as part of the present and the now is in essence, a sort of imagined experience, because the intention isn't necessarily, I am now me in this room. It's oftentimes something that maybe isn't so accessible that we want to learn more about, or we want to have some form of empathy for, which is what I think we as performing artists also will do in the embodiment of our craft.
And I think it, for me personally, taught me to listen to my own impulses. It really taught me to first know that I have impulses. Because I think I came from a sort of classical music background where a lot of things I would be given information, a score, a script, instructions, and then I would perform those instructions to the best of my ability. And it was 7 years ago when I really started to study walking and more acting, when I learned to trust my own impulses and trust my own intuitive voices, to learn to fill in between the words and the notes and find that untouchable
those
space.
Transitional spaces where there's sort of this neutrality or this sort of possibility of
it's flexible and it's always changing and it's always fresh. There's a freshness in it that was so exciting when I first started doing that practice, where I felt like I just would never know what was going to happen, and I didn't need to know, and whatever happened was always for my benefit. That's another thing that kind of blew my mind, that it was for my benefit. It wasn't just as a performer's, or it was something in it for me to be better ultimately. there was a healing power in it. And I think that's why I really stuck with it, because I saw that it wasn't just a performance practice, and it wasn't about improvisation or being a great actor. It was about healing parts of yourself that otherwise I personally couldn't access. I could only access them through that practice at the time. And now I feel like I have tools that can access it doing all kinds of things, but
including performing, I would say.
Including performing now, absolutely. And also even in my personal relationships and doing lots of things, but it's yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm not making sense, but
you're making a lot of sense. But I would also love to reground a little bit into just a history and context of you as a person, as a human, as a performer. You mentioned that you have a classical background. Would you share with the listener just where you're from, how you
absolutely
about being interested in the arts and your background in the classical?
Thank you for reminding me. Sometimes I forget that I have a background. So I'm from Latvia in Eastern Europe, and my family is Russian and Persian. And I grew up playing piano, going to music school. And then my family immigrated when I was in high school to the States. And then I finished high school here and then moved down to Los Angeles to get my undergrad and master's in piano performance. So I was very much pursuing a classical path, studying classical music. It was very rigorous. And a part of me sort of kind of knew that it wasn't quite the right thing for me, but I also knew that I wanted to be an artist. I didn't know what else I could do. I just really didn't know. No one in my family was a performer or an artist of any sort. And playing piano felt like a really practical thing, because that is a practical instrument. You can work as an accompanist and things like that. So I just want to pause. Okay. I'm doing good. I'm getting it more relaxed. I feel like at first I was like, on camera, but no.
You're doing great. It's great. I love it. We're amazing. Okay. I want to touch base with you before we hop back on. One, I think this is awesome. Two, I think we have enough.
Yeah, I know. We can go for hours, right?
Yeah. I'm going to make some more tea. You all right with that?
Yes, let's make more tea. Oh,
and then we'll just kind of maybe wrap up, and then you and I can chat.
Yes, I feel like I love this realm, this space. And I feel like so many people I can't really talk too much. They're like, what are you talking about?
Right. Maybe when we hop back on, we'll do a little recap and also be like, if this was super inaccessible to some of you guys,
let us know.
Let us know. We're happy to do follow-up. I really appreciate you being like, I know it sounds like, what is this? But it's also very simple. Like we just state an attention like this and we just enter it. So yeah, I appreciate that.
I want to make sure that people understand that we're not these like disconnected people from reality. It's like, no, what we do is very real, very straightforward. And you can just come and like do this thing with us and then go home and do the things that you do.
Absolutely. Like, practice entering and exiting this kind of space.
So, and it is shamanic. I think at its core, it is a shamanic thing.
And then also, I'm aware of that the shamanism is a very specific subsect of.
That's true. That's true.
Of a spiritual practice from a certain part of the world.
Exactly.
And so we also want to be mindful to not throw that word around, but it's also the word that people understand.
Exactly.
Maybe we'll talk about that. Maybe we should hit back play again.
I know. And I think it's like, this kind of, I don't want to be a spiritual tourist throwing these words around, but.
Right. Can we maybe chat about that?
Yeah.
And then we'll close?
That's great.
Unless we go off into something.
Let's do it.
I want to take this moment to say, if you'd like to become a supporter with a small monthly donation to help sustain future episodes, you can follow the link in the show notes to make your monthly contribution. And if you are feeling like you could use a little extra self-care support, I do offer higher ticket price one-on-one coaching container. I will leave the link to inquiry and application in the show notes as well. And now back to it. Okay, I want to give a little frame of reference. So I'm going to insert this back into the podcast, but we ended the podcast and then started a really awesome conversation. So we're going to insert this back in, but we can share a little bit.
Absolutely. So I wanted to say that even in this podcast, I was having these revelations. Like, it's like we were doing our process just through having a casual conversation. And I realized something when I talked about my work and how I'm not performing anymore, even though it's obviously a performative thing, that I'm actually building on what I've done in the past, but in a different way. So sometimes I still have this sort of guilty feeling that I've spent so many years working so hard, building a career in classical music, trying to be an opera singer and a proper actor and do all this stuff. And now I sing pop songs with my boyfriend. Like that's kind of
wonderful pop songs with a wonderful boyfriend.
Yeah, I'm so much happier.
Yeah.
And so a part of me judges that experience, that like, oh, this is what teenagers do. I'm a grown woman. I should, shouldn't be doing this, shouldn't be having this much fun. And it shouldn't be this easy. But even as we were talking today, I'm realizing I'm now in this kind of meta space where I don't have to work this hard anymore. It doesn't sound so indulgent, but I don't need to turn myself inside out and sing roles about death and torture and suffering and all of this concepts. Like now I can walk onto a stage and sing something very simple and very beautiful and enter a whole other dimension without performing, both for my own service and for the service of those in the audience. And I think I don't always like realize that's actually what I'm doing, that I'm doing this meta performance that's not a performance,
right?
Even though it is.
Yeah. And there's that inner critic, right, that you bring up, of the classically trained artist that maybe has an elevated sense of propriety or theory, or what is high art versus quote unquote low art. And some of us, and some of you who might be listening to this, myself included, I've studied as well classically with acting and dance, and there can be a desire sometimes to have a quote unquote higher craft and access to some sort of idea that we have of what it would mean to be a performing artist. That maybe, for me, it was growing up and seeing ballerinas on stage or watching movie musicals with my grandma. And I had this fantasy idea of what it would be like to be one of the women on stage or on screen. And so I had this concept of how I wanted to approach what I was going to do. But I simultaneously also had a judgment of certain ways certain people did stuff. And the more healing I'm doing, the more access I'm kind of having to all of this stuff, the more I'm being able to integrate the part of me that has been judgmental and be a little bit more curious and playful with my desire or willingness to fold in some of the more surface level or popular ways of connecting to audience. And that's not always something that I think we talk about, because we don't always want to be seen as someone really judgmental or someone who's a snob or is elitist. Sometimes we'll keep that aspect of ourselves really quiet, and then we don't give voice to the processing of what that part of us is trying to say, which might be, I'm sure you have your own stuff, but for me, it might be something like, well, I want to be highly valued. Well, I want someone to see me. I want to be well known for the quality of the work that I'm doing. And those things are, of course, we want all that, right? What are yours sort of?
I think even as you're saying, it's all sort of materializing in my mind. I think there's a lot of prejudice against artists as being superficial or indulgent or these childlike, infantile people. And so the way I protect myself from that is saying, but I'm a classical artist. I'm not indulgent. I suffer from my art and I practice 8 hours a day. And that protects me from that judgment where the judgment isn't valid. It doesn't matter what kind of art you're making. If you're committed, and if your art speaks to a person, it doesn't have to be complex and absurd and whatever, it can be simple and straightforward. But it is a way of protecting myself against my own family and people in my community who think art is indulgent and infantile.
Yeah.
That a real person has a real job.
Yeah.
And what we do isn't real.
Right.
And so for years, I've protected myself from that by really punishing myself with these art forms that I loved, but also they were so taxing and so exhausting, and also weren't me, because they were, they weren't really me ultimately. Right. And I feel like what I'm doing now is so much more intimate and direct and also easy. And it's amazing to do something that actually feels easy, that I don't have to spend 6 months preparing for a role. I can write a few songs and get on stage and sing them, and I know that they're good, and it's not Bach, it's not Shakespeare, and that's okay. Owning
sort of the simplicity of the craft that you're now able to simply engage with. And I think that happens for those of us who've been doing this for a while, this meaning your craft, whatever your craft is. There's a place you get to where it doesn't make sense anymore for it to be hard.
Absolutely. And it also doesn't serve the audience. It doesn't do anything for anyone if you are working so hard and sweating, your way through life.
Absolutely.
I think it's an ego thing. And for me, it was very much an ego thing, that if I'm working hard, then I'm enough.
Yes.
I'm okay.
Right.
Like,
yeah. And that's something I like to teach my students too. And I know that some aspects of the quality of your vocal lessons are more like Alexander based and a lot about deconstruction and releasing and surrendering to gravity and allowing things to be non-effortful almost. And I think that so much beauty and can come from a place of not pushing ourselves to be readier than we're ready for. And for me, there's the kind of grace there that comes for the artist towards the artist, that you are able to have this sort of metacognition of like, how are you treating yourself? How are you expecting yourself to show up? And I'm sure I will mention this book a million gazillion times on this podcast, but here it is. The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron is this seminal work. It's a 12-step program, and it's teaching you how to connect to your inner artist, face your inner critic, connect to the spiritual aspect of things, I would say. And it really does guide you through the intuitive aspects and channels of things. She uses the term God, but really it's more about how you're functioning with a certain kind of creative energy than it is that you believe in any sort of specific kind of theology. So the first time I did The Artist's Way, I found myself after the first chapter completing the exercises, maybe not even completing the exercises, maybe just reading the first chapter. I was on the floor in the fetal position, crying, sobbing, saying, "This is my home. I've found my home." And I just needed someone else to see what I've known all along and to help me understand a little bit of this really complex and sometimes otherizing path that many of us choose to walk. And there are ways that we can tune in to other artists who have practices that help them self-support. And the two of the main ones for Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way are having a daily journaling practice where you write 3 stream of consciousness pages every morning upon waking, like within the first 30 minutes of waking, which allows people, you listeners, to access that realm that Roksana and I were talking about more seamlessly. Because when we're in the alpha theta state, which is that space between waking and sleeping, which we naturally are in within those first 30 minutes of waking up, we are in we're in that sort of magical realm where information might come to us a little bit more easily. Now, Roksana and I have practiced going there whenever we want, however we want. So we have access to it in a certain kind of intentional and accessible way that you may or may not have depending on your background. So, and then the other form that this is the one I struggle with more is weekly artist dates, where you take yourself on a date, do something fun and creative for yourself. And I know, Roksana, you've mentioned your Eastern European background. I have a very rigid Japanese background, and there are cultural components to how our bodies and psyches resist joy, curiosity, pleasure. Yeah.
Just for the sake of pleasure, not even for the sake. I think for me, the artist date was like, that means I must make art. Well, like, no, you don't have to make art. You can just stare at a window if that's what you want to do. Like, I have to separate that where it's just for pleasure. It's just for fun. It's just for play. It's like having a nice lunch. It doesn't mean you have to make profound art or even have like cathartic experience. Sometimes I make myself work too hard and I can't even separate those things.
So, like taking the pressure off.
Just go on a walk, take a nap, whatever it is. Like, really, what is it that you want to do just for yourself?
And with self-care for performers, it's also an aspect of self-care, like caring for yourself, actually coming to a place of compassion and caretaking. You know, when I'm used to babysit, I would always enjoy bringing some sort of fun element into the time I was taking care of the child that I was with. There is an element of care, I think, that artists often will push away from just because we need to either prove that we are working really hard, or societal elements tell us we're not, or cultural elements keep us from being willing to step into. So there's a lot of very conscious reprogramming that we all step into, I think, after a certain point of being in our process, once we get tired of ourselves. And hopefully you have teachers or guides or access to community that are already doing this. And maybe you have a very supportive family background where there's a lot of security there. And if that's you, I also want to celebrate you and say how wonderful that you can share those ways of being and access points with your community around you. And know that also, depending on where other people are, sometimes there can be either resentment or a sadness that can come up between the space of you and where they're at. And I've experienced this from both ends of that, being the person feeling like I don't have, and also being the person feeling like I have and someone else doesn't. Yeah. And so I think the more we can really connect to like, well, what are the practices? What are the reasons why? What is the kind of like deep core sense of self-worth that we can connect to in our own self and our bodies and see inherently in everybody's experience around us, regardless of where they're at in their journey, whether they're an artist or not an artist. Ultimately, I think we can all be artists of our life. And what I love about artistry and the artist journey is that it's really about taking agency and ownership of how you are engaged with craft. And there's a degree of surrender, but there's also a degree of intentional practice and directional focus. And there's a lot of duality that inherently is a part of the process that I think is such a beautiful space to come into, especially in this. Often throughout history, we've had binaries and sort of black or white thinking. They say black and white thinking is trauma thinking. You're stuck in a traumatic experience when you can only think in polarizing ways. And I think depolarization of our process, for me, is a core aspect of what self-care and self-care practices, or the artist's way and these artist dates. Inserting options and opportunities for play and pleasure really allow us to move more from a place of belonging in our own bodies and in our lives and with our communities. Yeah.
100%. Gosh, we could just keep going.
So much to say. But thank you guys again for your time listening and engaging. And I can't wait to come back. I'm sure Roksana will be back. We'll do more of these together.
Exactly.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I am so happy to have been receiving some of the feedback from you guys on the first episode and how it's landed for you. And I would love to hear again about how this different kind of connection that I had with Roksana with the same intention landed for you. I do hope you'll hit that follow button and share this episode with your community so that it can reach as many ears as possible. I hope you go and explore the breadth of your own life and the creative potential and possibility that exists in the myriad of ways you can show up with the same intention to the same practice and find a new kind of way of being with it. What a gift. Bye-bye. I'll see you next time. Take care.